Philosophy was the first and only place, really, where I could talk about ideas in a mature environment where it wasn't about personality, it wasn't about status, it wasn't about ego, it was about the ideas. I think philosophy is very good at doing that for two reasons, really. One is that it teaches you the art of discussing rather than shouting. And two is that when there is a certain externalizing thing about philosophy, that when you look at ideas as presented by somebody else, you can talk about them without talking about yourself. I'm not talking about me, I'm talking about the ideas. And so along the way of the discussion, I find out what I value, what I like. And it's an impersonal way of looking at values and ideas, which I think is really important. I think philosophy is the place to do that, really.
What if philosophy wasn't a niche subject, but the beating heart of education itself? In this episode of Education Matters, we continue our Big Ideas series by making the case for philosophy, not just as an academic discipline, but as a vital way of thinking, learning, and living. If education is about developing thinkers and citizens capable of navigating complexity, then philosophy isn't optional, it's essential. My guest today is someone who's made it his mission to make philosophy accessible, engaging, and fun. Jonny Thomson is one of the most engaging voices in philosophy today. He's taught philosophy for over a decade before turning to writing full-time. He's now a columnist at Big Think and the best-selling, award-winning author of 3 books that have been translated into 22 languages. You may have also come across his work on social media as the creator of Mini Philosophy, a project that's made complex ideas accessible to millions around the world through short, clear, and often very witty reflections on life's biggest questions. In our conversation today, we discuss why philosophy should be at the center of a child's education and how it offers tools for reflection, dialogue, and navigating uncertainty. We talk about the influence of online discourse on student thinking, how philosophy can equip young people with intellectual humility. We also discuss the popularity of Stoicism and why fallacies go viral, the art of teaching ideas that stick, and how education systems might integrate philosophy, not as another siloed subject, but as a critical lens that sharpens every other discipline from science to history. Jonny shares what it's like to teach abstract ideas to teenagers, how philosophy connects to mental health, and why, in a world full of noise, curiosity and clarity still prevail. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Jonny Thomson. Jonny Thomson, welcome to the podcast. Where does this podcast find you today?
I am in North Oxfordshire, in a lovely village, not far from Banbury, and it's not raining, but it's due to rain later on. And all is well. It's autumnal, and I quite like the autumn. I like the crispy leaves, I like the falling of the apples, and I like Halloween increasingly. Used to hate it, but now I've just grudgingly accepted the fact that we inherit Americanisms eventually, and actually it's quite fun.
Yeah, Halloween and the fall here in Ontario where I am is just beautiful. Jonny, I always like to start the podcast by giving the audience a sense of who the human is behind the ideas and behind the work. So I'd love to start with where and when you grew up.
I grew up in the 80s in southeast Kent in the UK. So I grew up on the seaside, and you could see France from my bedroom. So I was very lucky. But I'm a peculiar sod in that I grew up on the seas, by the seaside, but I don't particularly like the beach. I don't like anything to do with sand. I find sand, like it's chaos. It gets everywhere. It gets in your toes, obviously. It gets in your food. And so I try to avoid the beach as much as possible, but I do love the sea. And I know it's a very common thing. It's almost a trope now, but I do. Well, where I live now actually is probably as far as you can get from the sea in an island nation. And I do very much feel the absence of that kind of, the horizon, the calm, but also the slightly tempestuous danger of the sea. I miss that. But again, I had nothing to do with the sea. I'm not a fisherman. I'm not a sailor. I don't go on the beach, but I just like walking and running along the seaside. And seagulls. I did recently a poll with my followers saying, what gives you a spark of joy? And one of the answers was a seagull. And I was like, well, at first I was like, what? That's weird. And then actually, they're right. They are absolutely right. The sound of the cawing, or the caw of a seagull, it gets something. It kind of like sparked something in me as well. So that really resonated with me, I should say. So yeah, that's where I grew up. And then I just left there to go to university up north in Durham. And then I ended up down in Oxford teaching. So that's my trajectory. That's my short life story, which dwelled on the sea. Sorry about that.
No problem at all. I mean, I was with you up until the seagull part. Maybe they're just different here. We're Toronto's on a lake, and our seagulls are horrible and mean. So
they are horrible and mean, but that's almost part of the nostalgia for me. Like, because I grew up in Kent, and I did a lot of my training, and also a lot of my life was from Brighton as well, which is down the road, which is a pebble beach, which actually I quite like. A lot of people moan about it, their seagulls are pests. They are, they attack people, and they nick all your food and stuff, and they're everywhere. They crap on everything, but it's kind of part of it. It's part of my childhood, my DNA. Yeah.
Well, if I can ask you to reflect a little further on your childhood. How did you play as a child?
How did I play as a child? I was very good at self-regulated play. From a very early day. From a very early day, I would do little make-believe games with my little figurines. I'd have Star Wars toys and Power Ranger toys, and we'd make like narratives and stories and things. I mean, I'm not a fiction writer now, but I could always make narratives in my head quite easily, and I would spend hours just making these stories. And then presumably it must have been around 7 or 8. I started reading, and then I from there, my head was always in a book at some point, I think. And I got that from my dad. So my dad and I would my parents separated quite early, and my dad and I, when we'd spend the whole weekend together, and there were days where we'd probably just speak a few words to each other, and we'd spend all our time on him on the sofa, me on the armchair, just reading books for almost like hours at a time, and they were blissful days. I enjoyed those kind of things. So it's a boring answer, but I wasn't really an outdoorsy type. It's one of those things that I wish I were more outdoorsy, both as a child and also now still. But actually, you've got to play the cards that you're dealt, and I don't think actually I am that rugged. I don't think I do well under a bivouac in the jungle, being attacked by pests and foraging for mushrooms. I actually do well in quite like cushy conditions, but with a book. So all that kind of self-revelation is important, particularly as you get older, to realize what makes you tick, what you're good at, what you like, I think.
Is there something that you remember you first loving to learn in particular?
It's interesting. I often think back to my school days, because I have a theory that actually it's school teachers more than the subjects themselves which guide students towards a subject, and parents and parenting. And the reason I say that is because I had a very bad physics teacher at school. And I don't mean this in a mean way. I just don't think that I'm sure they appealed to some people in the school, but their teaching style wasn't good for me. And so every time I read physics these days, I'm massively interested in it. I really want to dive in more. Of course, there comes a point where I just hit my limit. I need more base level physics to understand what's going on. But I'm really curious about physics. But it was taught poorly. And then I kind of think if I had a better teacher, an inspirational teacher, I would have been attracted more to physics. But no, I ended up doing philosophy, and because both my parents are psychologists. My mum was a psychotherapist, and my dad is a psychologist, especially in special needs and child development. And so around the dinner table, a lot of psychology was talked about from different angles. That's clinical and psychotherapeutic. And so when it came to A levels, which is our 16 plus choice, we have to choose what kind of 3 or 4 subjects you want to do. We couldn't do psychology, and so philosophy, and it was RS, which is religious studies, which kind of combined ethics and philosophy. That was the closest you could get to psychology without explicitly doing what your parents are doing. So I was kind of always attracted to that. So I am a chatty sod. I like to talk things over, and so I think philosophy, debating, discussions are important to me. So I think philosophy is a good place for that. And then I did drama as well, because I like kind of being center stage. I like kind of attention, I think, which is because I'm a second child, and my eldest brother was very attention seeking as well. So I think when you're a second child, you either go one or two ways. Either you make peace with the shadows, and you get used to just being on the side, or you desperately cling for any ounce of attention you can get. And I'm of the latter sort. I think I'm an attention seeking, people pleasing, needy person, but that's who I am. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you can definitely see the influences that got you to where you are today, and perhaps I should have started with this, although there would have been an intro before the audience was introduced to you. Can you just describe briefly for the audience now what you're up to?
So I run Mini Philosophy, which is a social network and column on Big Think, which it explores philosophical ideas in reels, in videos, 90 seconds or so. But then the column I have on Big Think and the newsletter I now have over on Substack, it allows those ideas to breathe a bit more. I go into them in a bit more detail. I explore some primary texts. I use a lot more quotations, and I look at the back and forth of things. But but broadly speaking, I run a social media network which explores philosophical ideas and invites people to reflect on them. That's the important point. I don't try to proselytize. I don't try to represent any of those ideas, and I often actually block people who don't understand that part of my page. Like people who seem to think that I represent the idea and therefore attack me for representing the idea. That's not what I'm doing. Of course, I do have ideas, and writing a book at the moment which actually explicitly say what I think is right. But my Mini Philosophy is about inviting other people to discuss. And actually, the comments page on my social media is almost as fruitful or as exciting as the videos themselves. So a lot of people like to go into those comments and look at what's going on and stuff. And some of the comments have got 500, 600 likes. So a lot of people are going into the comments to see what's going on. And I like to try and keep it as open and mature as a kind of like a Socratic kind of space as possible, which is, I don't want to use the word safe space because it is quite, it's very loaded language, but I wanted to be a place where it's a mature space. I prefer that word, a mature space where people can actually talk about things without screaming about them. That's what I want my project to be.
So I want to dive into that because that's obviously how we got to know each other, and I became familiar with your work. What aspects of teaching philosophy surprised you or even changed your thinking about the subject?
I often think about my trajectory, and I think what would have happened if I had done this first and earlier? Would I have been able to do this and gone, essentially self-employed and on my own as a entrepreneur now? But no, I don't think I would have, for two reasons, really. One is I think when you are a teacher, you have to learn the art of distillation. You have to learn to condense an idea into its bare essentials. And so that allows people to invite their interest and to go away and then research themselves. And because, philosophy is long, I studied at university. I did 4 years at university doing it, and people can study a lifetime doing academic philosophy. It's a deep, dense and intense subject. But I think when you're a teacher, you need to try and draw out the fundamentals of them. And I think that's what I learned, that skill. And then the second skill, of course, is the ability to articulate that and try to make it quite engaging, because you need to kind of be able to express the ideas in a way which I think people find gripping. And so I think those are valuable skills. And of course, it was a very classical philosophical education that particularly at university I had. It was essentially Plato to Wittgenstein, and then you got occasionally a few modern philosophers. Thomas Nagel, John Searle will be in there. And it's just very traditional Western philosophy, and that I think is what there's a structure to my page where some people quite like. Of course, it has its faults. It doesn't explore indigenous philosophies, doesn't explore a lot of kind of Buddhist philosophies and Japanese philosophies or African philosophies and things, because my knowledge base is very much limited to what I learned in a Western institution about philosophy. But at the same time, I think people like that because those who have done any philosophy in their past have a similar background. In fact, I quite like the comments when people write on my wall saying they tag a friend and they'll say, "Hey, it's just like that lecture we had in first year." And yeah, that's because I'm just doing what I know, basically. I am trying to remedy that. I'm trying to broaden my account and the Substack by interviewing people today. That's what I'm trying to do it, because it's so much effort to go away and learn an idea to the point that you can articulate it well without misrepresenting it. And I learned at the turn of the year, actually, that if you interview an expert, it's much quicker and easier to do, because what you can do then is learn what they say and you trust their advice. And what I try to do in my newsletter and in my reels is I'll often include their voice. as the explainer. So I'll introduce them, I'll set them up, and I'll also do cynically what's called the hook, get people engaged for the 3 seconds, make it exciting, and then I'll introduce their voices and stuff. And that's both in the newsletter, my articles, and on social media, because it needs to be exciting. And I hate to say it, but there is a certain type of academic who is not very engaging. Which is not a problem. It's not a fault in them, because their job doesn't require them to be an entertainer. And so I like to think I have both worlds, where I do entertain, I do introduce an idea, I do grip, and I do the hook, but then also I can explore an idea with these people. So that's I've rambled. So I do this often in interviews. I ramble and go all over the place. You got to jump in and tell me where to stop and where to go.
No, I love it, and I think a lot of the greatest learning in my life come from tangents. So when I get curious, I'll jump in for sure.
Thank you.
So, I mean, you mentioned the teaching. You went from teaching to writing a book called Mini Philosophy, a small book of big ideas. And it sounds like it grew out of your passion for teaching ideas and making philosophy accessible. Mm-hmm. Where did the original spark for that book come from, and how does it how did your teaching influence the way you approached it?
Oh, that's interesting. So essentially the teaching was a massive part of that, and a massive part of my career, mostly and practically because I have holidays. Teachers have holidays. And this, before I had a wife, before I had children, and when holidays were, dare I say it, quite boring actually if you're a teacher, because all of my other friends who weren't teachers were doing their jobs in the holidays. So you have two options. Either you hang out with other teachers and talk about school, which is boring, or you spend time on your own in your house, which is boring. So I had to set up a side hustle, really. And then my side hustle was Mini Philosophy. So I had all, of course, this body of resources. I realized early on that, there are textbooks out there, but actually it's quite easy and better for me just to make my own resources. And I put them on PowerPoints. Even back in the day, I would have little support images on my PowerPoints, and I'd explain them to my students. And then in the holiday times, I thought, right, let's put this on Tumblr. It was Tumblr back in the day, a different social media. I put it back on Tumblr, and they proved popular. People liked them. People liked the way I explained these ideas. And so then I moved over to Instagram, and again, it kind of took off there, but not massively. It was up to about, 60, 70,000 followers, which back then I thought was amazing. It's brilliant. And that's a lot of followers. That was then enough for me to send a massive cold call email to to all of the agents in the UK. So there's a website, I don't know if it still exists anymore, probably not actually, but which collates all of the agents in the UK. And I literally did A to F in one day. And I said to myself, I would do F to Z the next day. And luckily within a day, my now agent, guy called Charlie Brotherstone, replied back saying, yeah, I think you got something really good here. Let's turn it into a book. And so what we did, we took 10 best performing captions, explainers. This is before my face was on screen, because I'm a teacher. I was terrified of being on screen. And we then sent them to a publisher, which was Hachette, headline part of Hachette, and they liked the idea. But what I realized then, and is true now actually, is that the really good thing about social media, or at least what I do with social media, is it acts as a crowdsourcing of opinion. That by then I had about a year and a half or 2 years worth of content. And some of it had failed. Some of it completely flailed around, and there'd been 2 likes and no comments, where some had massively picked up. And so I thought, right, let's take those and turn those into a book. And of course, the publisher then thought, well, yeah, these are quite good. That then led to the book, and then the book then was very successful. It sold in 22 countries. It was then made off into 2 spin-offs, Mini Big Ideas and Mini Psychology. And that was the point where my presence on Big Think, for example, I was writing for Big Think at the same time, and they said, do you want to come on and write for us? And Freddie was 3, so my eldest was 3 years old at the time, and Charlie was just being born. And we kind of thought, right, what am I going to do? Am I going to carry on commuting to work in this as a school, or am I going to go writing full time, work at home? Bit of a risk, because teaching is a very steady and safe job. Or do I take this risk and work at home? Let's do that. And I did do that, and that's when I went front of camera. Because once I was out of teaching, I thought, right, okay, why not do that? And then that proved really popular. People seem to like me as a person, my voice, my cadence, the way I explain ideas. And now I'm at about 730 or 1,000 on Insta, and about the same across Facebook and TikTok. So yeah, about 1.5 overall. So it's exciting. Yeah, it's really exciting. Sorry, you're going to interrupt.
Yeah, what are the biggest challenges when you're trying to distill these really dense philosophical concepts into, engaging bite-sized media?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the obvious challenge is the fact you can't do it properly. That you oversimplify to the point of misrepresenting, and I have been guilty of that. Certainly, I'm not perfect. But I hope I'm getting better. But there are mistakes along the way. That if you do simplify something so much, you lose not only nuance, but you lose enough detail to make it its own thing. That's one danger. And the other danger is that I'm constantly oscillating in terms of what I should focus on. Because when I originally set up, as I said earlier, I was doing university level content. I was doing stuff which you learn as an undergraduate. And so my original fan base, and I still think there is a big portion of my fan base is still of this kind of demographic, are keen on proper, deep end philosophy. They want to read about Saul Kripke and Frege and Plato and Aristotle's logic and stuff, and the dense stuff and the dense corners of epistemology and the philosophy of language and stuff. But they don't do well on social media. They won't do well at all. So I'm kind of caught in between an internal debate, which I still live with now, where I try to oscillate between dense and proper, with a quote, philosophy, which you learn at university, which I know will do back poorly, and the popular stuff, which is the Stoicism, the everyday philosophy, the aesthetics, the ethical dilemmas, the thought experiments. They all always do well. So I try to oscillate between the two, but I am conscious that I'm pandering a bit too much to the soft philosophy at the moment. So maybe I've got a deep end logic and epistemology coming out just to right the ship.
Well, you kind of got to my next question there, which was, what kind of philosophical ideas tend to resonate most with the audience? And maybe the second part of that you didn't answer is why.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to give away the game too much, but I guess it's not really much of a state secret that people. It's all shareability. Almost all of the algorithms work upon engagement. And all of the platforms rank different levels of engagement, and they think that a basic engagement would be a like. The next step up would be a comment. The next section up would be sending it to a friend, and the ultimate engagement would be sharing it to your own platform. So the more shares you get to your platform, the algorithm says, "Well, this is obviously very popular. People engage very well. Let's promote that to everybody else." And I've realized that people will only share two things really. One is that it's like, "Oh, this is so me. This explains me really well." Or people love the opportunity to point at the opposition, the other, and say, this is them. Over there, this is those evil people, those idiots, those buffoons.
Right.
So if you play to either of those, they often do very well. And of course, it's not an easy thing to do that, to be honest. I'll make it sound easier than it is. It's hard to come up with something which is resonant and relatable. And it's equally hard to make something which is not explicitly tribal, but allows people to be tribal.
Right.
So for example, I did one about Bonhoeffer's theory of idiocy being worse than evil. It's probably one of the best reels. It's got something like 3 million views, and it got me like 20,000 follows. It's by far and away one of my popular reels. And the reason why that's popular is because people think that the other are idiots. So people post it and they'll put like a caption saying, "Oh, this is the Democrats, this is the Republicans, this is Christians, this is atheists, this is the other people over there." And that's why it does really well. And I try to resist doing it too often because it is cynical. It's pushing the kind of like the tribal buttons. But also they're important theories. They're important to learn. So, but and also relatable and resonant ones do well as well. The one, so that's why I think they do well. But inversely, there are some things where I used to. I think I feel dirty sometimes. Dirty is the wrong word, but I feel like I've let myself down sometimes because there are things where I need to point to a philosophy which is boring and is possibly also requires kind of like a self-evaluation and makes people feel a little bit kind of like, well, hang on, what is that about me? Is that pointing at me? It's calling me. But when I do that, people won't share them. People won't want to do anything. So for example, I think taboo is a really interesting topic, like as in why people won't talk about certain topics. And, the Marcus de Sade, I think, talks about this, and that's where we get the word sadism, for example, about these ideas in our heads, these intrusive thoughts that we all have. But no one's going to share a reel about intrusive thoughts. Someone's going to be like, "Yeah, this is me. I have thoughts about killing my brother, literally with a knife," kind of thing. But these people have these thoughts, which obviously, and I think it's really interesting, but people won't share it. So I kind of like those. I mean, that's an extreme example, but there are lots of moments where I think it's important people learn them, but they won't be shareable. But then that's probably the algorithm, not me. And hopefully the column, the newsletter, and the future books will be able to correct that a little bit, where it's less kind of enslaved to the algorithm.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You mentioned philosophers like Marcus Aurelius, and the philosophy of Stoicism is really popular. Why would you, or can you speculate as to why you think the Stoics are really popular now? Is it from like this inner sense of guilt that's happening in this technological age?
I think 3 reasons, really. I mean, three reasons. One is that I think the Stoics are really good writers. Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, accessible, Epictetus, they're very good writers. They do, this sounds really arrogant, they're doing what I'm doing. They're condensing the philosophy in a way which is applicable to people. And the second reason, I think, is a really neat philosophy. It involves a science, it involves a way of life, and the metaphysics, and it's kind of neatly divided into categories and things. And the third reason is that it's full of practical and effective, what we call life pro tips, advice, ways that you can live and get by. The dichotomy of control, which is, accept what you can change what you can and accept what you can't, and, that kind of stuff. And the gap, which is the idea that you can choose your reactions to things, all of the things which eventually would morph into what's called cognitive behavioral therapy. Aaron Beck, consciously said that his psychology was based upon Stoicism. All of those things which have been proven to work in laboratory environments and scientific studies, that have their roots in Stoicism. So those are the 3 things. But also the fourth thing, which is probably less talked about, is that it's always been a quite elite philosophy. So Stoicism, and even today, you see this today, that Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, people, they call themselves Stoics. And, I don't think they have an understanding of Stoicism, which is nuanced or correct.
They definitely don't.
But there is an interesting trend which existed even in the ancient world, that people who are powerful and rich and high status happen to be Stoics. And that means they can write books, and that means they can get those books published, and that means they can distribute them across their massive networks and stuff. And that's what you're seeing today as well, a little bit as well, because that's why Stoicism aligns itself very well in the business column, in the business sections as well. So those are 4 factors why I think Stoicism is popular. But the reason why I like it is because, I think it's a really useful and practical philosophy that can help people and save people. Some people's lives have been saved by the Stoics and the cognitive behavioral therapy that's based upon it, really. That's a very long answer again to a short question.
Oh, well, it was a great answer. What other philosophies or philosophers are among the most watched or viewed or liked or shared?
Well, people like Asian philosophy. And the reason why I don't like normally using the word Asian, because it's such a broad category, and it risks oversimplifies what kind of Edward Said called Orientalism. It kind of like puts them into one kind of blob when they're not one blob. It's very complicated. But the reason I say they're Asian is because there's a certain exoticism to these Asian ideas. So, for example, the classic example is wabi-sabi. This is a Japanese concept of the beauty that you find in impermanence, like a broken ruin or a cracked tree, or even death and decay. There's a certain beauty that you can find in that, and I think people love those ideas. Now, you often find them online as being untranslatable words, and they often prove very popular as listicles, and people love them. There's whole Instagram accounts based upon these untranslatable words, but they're not untranslatable because we talk about them, we can understand them. I just explained wabi-sabi to you in about 2 sentences then, and you don't have to be Japanese to appreciate the impermanence of reality and the seasonality of existence. But the reason why people like them is because there is a certain exoticism to them. They are distant and they are remote from where we are. Whereas I could probably point out to 4 or 5 people in the Western tradition who have said very similar things. Schopenhauer, great example. He talks about, the impermanence of reality, and even the Stoics talk about them. Memento mori is a massive part of it. That everything will die, and appreciate the beauty of the moment. It's not as if the Western philosophical tradition was impervious to the idea of seasonality. But so those ideas are Asian ideas. And the reason I do put them in the quotation, because people like them because they are different to what they have grown up with. This is why I've got a slight bugbear with, what people call secular Buddhism. People like to say, people like to identify as being a secular Buddhist, but actually, in my mind, that seems like an oxymoron. It's like we would say a secular Muslim. You wouldn't say a secular Christian. You have Christian philosophers, you have Muslim philosophers, and you have Buddhist philosophers. But to identify as a secular Buddhist seems peculiar to me. So they do very well. And as I said earlier, that increasingly critical thinking does very well. People like fallacies, people like debate and the idea of truth. They do pretty well. And of course, any opportunity for people to shout at each other. So anything about religion or atheism gets people massively engaged. And it's getting better, actually, weirdly. I don't know whether people have realized that my page is not the place to do it, but it used to be that if I put a page, I remember doing one ages ago about religious experiences and about the argument from religious experiences, where people argue that the sheer weight and sheer number of people having religious experiences is itself evidence and testimony that there must be some kind of divinity. And it's absolutely picked off in the comments. I think there's something like 2,000 people, like people going back and forth, getting quite vitriolic and aggressive. Now, it doesn't tend to do it as much. I did one about John Hick's idea of epistemic distance the other day, which is essentially the problem of evil. That why doesn't God intervene when people are doing horrible and horrendous things to each other? And the comments are far more mature and intelligent and dare I say, respectful to each other. And I wonder whether it's my audience have realized that, as I say, this is not the place to do those kind of screaming battles, but they still do get people out and debating. There is still, healthy debate amongst people there. So, those are the kind of categories really which tend to do well. So if anyone's trying to build their philosophical social media, go to their space.
I don't think you're going to have too many competitors overall in that space because of the aforementioned difficulty of what you do.
Thank you.
Well, I have probably got another 1,000 questions about how philosophy is resonating online, but I feel like that would be more for me than for this audience, because I do want to turn to looking at philosophy and education. And I want to start with a relatively recent post of yours there. So I'm going to quote you and then just ask you to expand on it, because I thought this to be very succinct and powerful. You said, quote, "Philosophy helps people because what you believe will affect how you behave. And so reading good philosophy can help you become a fuller, happier, and better version of yourself." Can you just comment on that further?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great quotation from me. Well done, Jonny. And it essentially is plagiarized from William James, really, and his idea of pragmatism. And we are motivated to do anything. But there must be some kind of value or motivating factor behind that kind of behavior. And so Nietzsche said it originally, but Viktor Frankl built an entire book about it, which is the idea that if you have a why, you can impair any how. So if you find that why, that motivating factor, you can do a lot more than you think you can. I often say to people, some say, I can't do this, or I don't want to do this. And stuff. Or no, if they can't do this, you say, well, what if I gave you like £2 million right now to do it? Do you think you could do it? Well, yeah, they probably could. A lot of the times people, when they say that, they could. So the factor, it wasn't the factor that they couldn't do it or they haven't got the time to do it. It's the fact they haven't got, their value system is different to that. So I think philosophy is very good at digging into those values, and it makes you realize what you are motivated by and what kind of gets you up in the morning and what kind of like makes your priority matrix. Because everybody does that. We all have ultimately the same 24 hours in the day. I sound like one of those business gurus now. And you've got to decide how you do that. For a lot of people, that's almost the decision's almost taken away from them, because it's a matter of kind of earning money to feed children, to pay the rent, and to keep the roof over your head. And those are how you're able to spend. But even that is ultimately a value system. You don't have, you could ultimately not do that. You could abandon your children. I'm not saying you should, by the way, guys. Anyone listening, I'm not saying you abandon your children, but everyone's got value systems. And a long time ago, I used to say to people, I'd ask people, what are you watching on TV at the moment? And sometimes they would say, oh, I haven't got time for TV. And I've become that bore now. People say, what are you watching on TV? I say, well, I haven't got time for TV. Well, actually, it's not true. I have got time for TV, but what I spend that time on instead is prattling around on Instagram, or writing a book, or playing with my children and stuff, or maybe going to do some exercise, some of which is wholesome and socially approved, some of which is not wholesome and not socially approved. But the fact is, I have decided them. So getting to the underlying values is really important to motivating any people's behavior. Now, if we're looking at it in educational context, if you're looking at a student and you're asking them why they didn't do homework or why they didn't put the work into the class and stuff, I mean, often there's a motivational factor there, isn't there? They don't see the point, or they don't identify with that subject. Now, sometimes you can resolve that by addressing that issue, or sometimes you can't. Sometimes we force, at least in Western, almost all educational systems, we force children to go through things they don't enjoy or don't see the point of or don't like, and nothing will really remedy that. But I guess the point, of course, of good education is to harness those values and make people want to learn, want to be curious, and philosophy is an entire subject built upon curiosity, I would say. So again, rambling at you. Sorry, I hope if there's something in there you could edit to be good.
No, there's no editing to be done here. We're free flow, and I think it's a good answer. But maybe let me ask you to put a finer point on the place of philosophy in like the elementary and high school systems. Do you think we need to bring philosophy proper more centrally to elementary and to high school? And how would you do that given everything you've learned about, how interested people are, generally speaking, in philosophical ideas and explorations?
Well, yes, yeah. I mean, I obviously would say that, we should bring more philosophy back into schools generally. I mean, the cliched answer that a lot of philosophers tend to reel out is that it teaches you critical thinking, that we learn about arguments and logic and fallacies and biases. And that is true. That is really important to learn about fallacies and logic and things, just because all dogs are mammals doesn't mean that all mammals are dogs. It's important to learn that as a basic logical principle. And philosophy is the art of drawing those kind of points out, basic logic. But I mean, what I would say is a point that I'd tie back to what I said earlier is actually, at least in my experience when I was at university, philosophy was the first and only place really where I could talk about ideas in a mature environment where it wasn't about personality, it wasn't about status, it wasn't about ego, it was about the ideas. Now, of course, that ego does creep in eventually because, that's human nature and stuff. But I think philosophy is very good at doing that for two reasons, really. One is that it teaches you the art of discussing rather than shouting. And two is that when there is a certain externalizing thing about philosophy, that when you look at ideas as presented by somebody else, you can talk about them without talking about yourself. So when I talk about de Beauvoir's ideas of in the second sex, for example, or I talk about Schopenhauer's idea of pessimism or whatever, I'm not talking about me, I'm talking about the ideas. And so along the way of the discussion, I find out what I value, what I like. And it's an impersonal way of looking at values and ideas, which I think is really important. I think philosophy is a place to do that, really. So two answers, really. One is that it does dissect the nature of arguments, and also teaches you how to have discussions without having arguments, I think.
So I think we were obviously both in agreement that philosophy should be formally a more integrated part of the education system. How would you go about it? Would you start introducing, a subject alongside science and math and reading and English?
Yeah, I mean, it's
elementary school.
Yeah, I mean, elementary school would be great. So I occasionally do events, and I did a local Cub Scouts event recently. Cub Scouts in the UK are they were for like between 8 years old and about 13 years old. And I went there and I thought, okay, crikey, Moses, how am I going to do this? I can't teach Wittgenstein to a 9-year-old.
But what I did is,
yeah, exactly, guys. Yeah, do you guys ever think about death? So I went in there and I had a list of thought experiments, and there's a really because people do thought experiments all of the time. Like the would you rather game is something that you play with your kids from an age of 5 or 6, and they are obviously they're fun. Would you rather fight one duck-sized horse or 100 horse-sized ducks or whatever? I don't know, whichever way around it is. Sometimes they're fun, but sometimes they are like would you rather live with mummy or would you rather live with daddy? Would you rather I don't know, that everybody in the world, I don't know, was richer? I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but that people love those kind of would you rather questions. And the trolley problem, Davidson's Swamp Man did very well, and all of these philosophical thought experiments really invite people to talk about things. But the problem is, and a lot of your audience will understand this as well, is the constant battle that educational sectors have between learning for learning's sake and the future and developing skills and certification. And I think the sad truth is that a lot of schools by necessity are forced towards focusing on certification, and that trickles down into the students. Well, we talked about motivation, about values earlier and stuff. People would see the value of certification over any soft skills, and I think that's the problem.
The issue, though, is the entire certification process for careers is falling apart, right? And will continue to do so over the next 5-10 years with the impact of AI. So this is I think one of the first things that I said to you is that when we met is that I have this kind of pet theory that that AI is forcing us all to become philosophers in a way, because what's left after, the skills that we've gone to school for traditionally have been taken by robots and powerful AIs, and what kind of meaning do we find in our lives at that point? So, part of this kind of embedded series within the podcast around philosophy is to try to get senior leaders to start thinking about how do we bring this mode of critical thinking proper, because you hear that a lot and it's on mission statements of school boards all across the world, really. But really, what's at the core of critical thinking? For me, it's always been the discipline of philosophy, which is, obviously part of all traditions, as you mentioned earlier. But I'm really interested in thinking about how do we really bring this into practice into the school system? So you've taught this and then had this wonderful career to this point in making, these complex ideas more simple. Do you have any recommendations for teachers that are not like you and I, who have an undergraduate degree in philosophy, is how they can start bringing this in, and whether they connect it to literacy, which would be easier to do? You can obviously connect it to a whole bunch of other disciplines. But do you have any kind of sense as to where folks like that can begin?
It's difficult because, as I said earlier, I was a teacher and I do understand it from both sides. I understand it from the whatever you call them, like a board of governors, an executive or headmaster, whatever you call them. They've got to ultimately give enough time to the subjects which give them certification, which gets kids in and satisfies the school boards, whatever, and stuff like that. And also from a teacher's point of view, I've not met a teacher yet who's always like, oh, I've got an extra hour, I could slot something in. What about the philosophy? Let's put some philosophy in. Every teacher is up against it. Every minute is precious. And so, the only way to really resolve that, at least in a practical way, in an ideal world, I'll say, like, set up philosophy societies, have an hour every week where you teach philosophy, but that's just not going to happen, really. The best way to do it, really, in a practical way, is to incorporate the philosophy of X into the syllabuses and into the curriculums. And that is, to be fair, even when I was at school, that does exist. There is a philosophy of everything. All of the sciences, you can look at the scientific method as a basic point. And within, English, as you mentioned, literacy, you can look at philosophical kind of books, essays, whatever, and things, which are just as kind of, I think artistic and as accomplished as a lot of people written by authors and things. You could talk about French, obviously, in any languages. You could look at German, French philosophy and stuff. And it does, when I was at school at least, it did seem to be incorporated that way. There is a philosophy of everything, urban planning, in geography, in art, philosophy of aesthetics and stuff, in design technology, which is, which over here is like, building things. There's a philosophy of architecture and of spaces and things. You can incorporate philosophy in every subject. So I think that's probably the most practical way of doing it. But then, of course, the question then becomes, why would an exam board do that? Because there is a probably quite a vocal portion of those who in education who probably don't think there is much point in philosophy, because if you put philosophy into the curriculum, it pushes something else out. Now, I would argue that philosophy underpins the entire discipline. I mentioned earlier, when you go back to first principles, when you go back to the kind of motivation for doing a subject, the philosophy of X is why people will study X and things. And also, I think a point which I don't think I touched on yet is that I think it's fun. That I do honestly think that the reason why the success of mini philosophy has done quite well is because people realise that actually these things are quite fun. In fact, if I wish I had a penny for the amount of time people have said to me, like, oh, I didn't know this was philosophy, or thank you for giving a word to an idea I've always had, or I didn't know this, some philosopher had said this. People like the ideas. So that's the way I'll say. So speaking to exam boards and syllabuses and would probably be the best way to do it, really, because I know fully well that schools are up against it, that it's not as easy as putting a philosophy club in over the lunch break, because lunch break's already taken over by PE, eating lunch, meeting your tutor to go over your homework, or, meeting the headmaster or whatever, because you had a cigarette at lunch, whatever. It's already jam-packed.
That was more an 80s, 90s thing, Johnny, I think.
Yeah, you're right. Probably vaping now, isn't it?
Now it's vaping in the bathroom, yeah.
Yeah, or saying something a bit inappropriate.
So if you were to create a high school curriculum, knowing everything you know now, around philosophy. I mean, I think your work would be an awesome intro for a lot of students. But what would that look like? A high school course, intro course.
It's an interesting question, and it's a question that is. I had a debate with a close friend of mine about a couple of weeks ago about this. Actually, about what if you could go back to bare what's the word? First principles and start talking. What would you do? Because there's that famous TED talk, isn't there, or TEDx animation where they draw about how the educational system is designed for 19th century industrial people and stuff like that. Even the fact we have these long summer holidays is because we were agrarian societies. We need to go and pull in the corn over August. We don't need that anymore. That's dated. So if you were to go back to bare principles, because the fact is that AI is here, and also, if I'm honest, very few, subjects require a decent schooling. Obviously, you need basic level of arithmetic and literacy and critical thinking skills, but ultimately you can do those up until almost primary age. When you get to secondary school, what is the point of secondary school? People talk a lot about, why am I bothering to learn quadratic equations? Why am I bothering to learn about the water cycle? Why am I bothering to learn about the periodic table, whatever? And if because it used to be a case of by getting these certificates, you prove that you can learn and that you can prove and then you can go to your job and then do your job well. But with AI and with the fact is that most people learn their jobs on the job these days, what is the point? So if I was to go back to bare first principles, and this is very idealistic, it's not going to happen anytime soon, I would just go back to a place of loving learning, where people could almost just study what they want. Teachers and schools are free to choose what they want. And it's kind of like if you want to be capitalist about it, it can be very much a product-led market. This school offers this thing, so enroll your students there. And eventually schools would start to offer things which are engaging and exciting and kids want to learn. I haven't really thought this through enough, really. It might be that, the schools which offer, courses on Netflix or Taylor Swift happen to get all the kids in and stuff, or whatever. But, something which gives more flexibility and freedom to the schools and the teachers to do things. So I remember I was very lucky at school that I had very small class sizes. It was quite a small town I lived in. And my history class, there was 2 of us in our history class. It was tiny. And Mr. Brown, I hope he's still alive. I'm not sure. He probably is not anymore. It's quite a long time ago. He would manage to get the curriculum done pretty quickly. And then he would have this other portion of the lesson where he would just give us an education in what he thought was interesting. And I remember learning about classical music, about classical art, about philosophy, and I learned about areas of history which are outside of the curriculum and stuff. And I thought that, again, this is entirely anecdotal. It's not true for everybody. Not everyone loves learning in the same way I do. But those extra bit was probably the golden part of my education. It was the bit where a teacher who was excited about what he could teach could then, explore these interesting areas of the world. So a rambling and gelatin answer for you, which you can't pin down at all.
Well,
but, there it is.
Yeah, I can kind of give some of my thoughts on that subject. I think one, you mentioned a big part of students' dispositions, especially at a young age. They all do these thought experiments. They are open to new ideas. So I think it's a very natural transition to what I would consider, is necessary, which would be a foundational course in, it doesn't have to be Western philosophy per se, but Western philosophy does have this, it is really at the foundations of how civic society is organized. Right, especially Europe. All over the world really now, when democracies work. So, I think you mentioned something too that gets a lot of popularity there, like fallacies. Like that's how I was introduced to philosophy, and I thought it was a great way to, or would be a great way to stimulate thinking. Like I went home and every argument my parents made or my friends made, I'm like, no, it's a fallacy. You can't say that because. And then, of course, to the central figure of Socrates, which I think is absolutely fundamental to civic society, to understanding the other, to having empathy. But any other broad strokes that you would add to that?
Well, as you were talking, I was thinking also about a bit, which I haven't really talked about so far, is the fact that when you learn philosophy, and particularly as I'm doing when I present ideas often juxtaposed alongside each other, is that you realize how nuanced everything is, and the fact that the world encourages black and white thinking. The world encourages you to take a side and to defend that side with peculiar aggression often. And I think when you look at all of the ideas alongside each other, you realize that there is this diverse spread of ideas, but also it's complicated. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I was thinking about that is because you were talking about civic philosophy and political philosophy. And I think that's never that more true today, because I don't think we realize how boring democracies are, and complicated, almost by intent, by design. They are messy, they are complicated, and they are slow. You know, a lot's been made, for example, in the UK, that we're building this railway called HS2, which is a time and a money sink. It's huge, but it's a railway from London to Birmingham, which was then going to go to Manchester, which is meant to be high speed, cut the journey cost by about half an hour, and it's taken us something like 20 years to even do half of it so far, and it's going to take another 15 years, and it's cost X billion amount of pounds. And then people are like, well, if you look at China, they've done the same thing in half a year. But they've also done so on the bodies of 1,000 workers, and right. It's with civil liberties and civil rights being eroded and things, and very quickly, but very dangerously. Fine, if that's what you want, then go for that. But democracies are messy; they are complicated because they involve so many stakeholders, and I think it's important to realise that life is messy, because when we run up against people and each other, everybody's got their own values and intentions and desires and goals and stuff. And so you need a degree of compromise and cooperation if you are to get anything done. And I do worry that the world, particularly a world without philosophy, or I should bring back philosophy to remedy this, does see it as that kind of like a conflict all of the time. That it's not about compromise and cooperation, because compromise is weak. It's beta. It's kind of simps. It's what do they call? And there's names for particularly a man who kind of compromises too much. I can't remember what it is. And I do think that's dangerous. I think it's a dangerous trend, that we need to appreciate the nuance and the grey and a bit more. I'm sure people will think that's wrong in itself, that we need to be more passionate about things. But I'm British, so maybe we should bring back a bit more stiff upper lip to things and just kind of like, get on with it.
Well, I mean, it's horrifying to think of what others would here in Toronto, where we have massive transit problems, would think of your slowdowns. Because I had someone from Manchester here actually working on the railway lines, and he said that you were 10 to 15 years ahead of what's happening here. So you can imagine the snarl of our system.
That's it. The grass is always greener, isn't it? And we look at Germany and think, like, why are their trains so good? And
that's
you
right.
guys are good.
Yeah, and I think there's models there to learn from. But if we can turn back to like philosophy and education for another minute before I've got a few wrap up questions for you. One of the things that has been identified to me in private from school leaders is what they believe is held philosophy back from being more formally implemented by any government, is that there is a risk when you scale it across, a province of like, 12 or 15 million like Ontario, that eventually you're going to have a teacher who loses some of the nuance and starts a lot of conflicts, because you're diving into, very difficult areas. You have any sense on how we can mitigate that concern?
Yeah, I massively agree, and I think I've got like a lifetime career plan. I do want, once I've done this philosophy, I do want to go back to particularly early years education actually and schooling thing, because I do think it's peculiar that we pay teachers so poorly, and particularly in the UK, they are relatively underqualified for what is, I think, probably the most important job any society should have, really. Because you're creating the society of tomorrow by the quality of your teachers and parenting actually as well. And so I think, the quality of parenting, the quality of teaching will define what, society you're going to have. And yet we do underpay them and teachers, and we do kind of under demand them, because as in under demand, or something as in underqualified them, in the sense that we don't have as many qualifications and requirements for them. I think, is it Norway or Sweden? One of the Scandi countries requires PhD levels.
Yeah, Finland, masters to teach.
Masters, right? Yeah, level of teaching and things like that. And obviously, there's a practical requirement, because everything within education, as any kind of governmental choice, is a way, a payoff between idealism and practicality. And teaching isn't just about education. Teaching is also childcare. It is also a necessary for the economy, that when their parents dump their kids at school so they can go and be good economic units. That's a necessary that's part of a school. So, and therefore we have huge schools, we have huge kids, and we have huge requirement for teachers. So you can't pay them all. You can't double all of their salaries, and you can't demand that they all have master's degrees. But yet something does need to change there. Like, I mean, I'm not the only person saying that, education needs more money, because everyone in department, if let's imagine we're around a cabinet table discussing who needs more money. Defence will say they need more money, health need more money, and education need more money. But it seems to me as if all of the others are predicated upon education, just for values and just for the ability to learn. So sorry, that's my kind of like pro-education rant at you, but I'm preaching to the choir here, aren't I? Let's, where's that money coming from? That's the problem.
I think what we found here in Canada, where teachers are much better paid than probably the rest of the world, with some exception probably to some of the Scandinavian countries, where we actually learn a lot from each other. I think you're pretty spot on when it comes to teacher prep and teacher training. I think that's going to be a massive point of emphasis, or should be, given how, and maybe necessarily and mercifully so, AI is upsetting the apple cart, because the entire structure we talked about, certification, is AI-able, if I can put it that way. So things have to change now, and that's sort of why I want to get these ideas out to folks that listen to this, that are at that level where they can start making at least incremental change.
Absolutely agree. Yeah, I mean, AI is almost making a farce of a lot of the examination system, isn't it? Really?
Right. So Jonny, my penultimate question is always, if you had a magic wand, and it's an all-powerful magic wand, what would you do to the education system? Teacher pay, you've already said that one, which is a big one. But what else would you do to redesign it, re-envision it in a world where, for the sake of this conversation, philosophy is much more appreciated?
Yeah. Do you know what? I'm going to dodge your question a little bit, but you'll see why. I've got a slightly pet theory, unprovable, and maybe there are studies I haven't looked at them, but I actually believe that more good and bad is done by parenting, by your upbringing, your family, than by a school. So I would actually argue that good parents who put their kids in a bad school is better than having bad parents who put their kids in a good school. Does that make sense?
Does, yeah.
So if I had waved a magic wand, I would give parents more time, resources, training, and capability to educate their children, to talk about ideas, to read of them, explore ideas, or teach them at home as well as much as anything else. So that's what my magic wand would be, if it is an entirely magic wand, because that is so obviously difficult to achieve. So that's my theory.
I think the practical side of that would be to build more community-based schooling, where parents have the opportunities to learn alongside kids, and there are various models for that. So I think that's pretty astute. Jonny, my last question is always, what book, music album, podcast, article would you recommend to the audience?
Very difficult, because is it just for academic enrichment, or just for enjoyment?
You can say 20 things.
Okay, well, you know what? So the only podcast I listen to religiously, the only one every podcast I listen to, is a guy called Adam Buxton, who does interviews with celebrities. And it's not necessarily philosophical, but the philosophical bit about it is that Adam Buxton has an incredible way of having conversations with people. And it's something, listen to how it's done. And very quickly, it's not Socratic. It's not like a Socratic dialogue, Socratic irony, but there is something about his manner which elicits a depth of conversation, which I think we should all have more of. And if we could all have more of the kind of conversation you hear on those kind of podcasts, I think it's great, because it's not the same as like a Desert Island Discs or turning up on your national radio stuff, which is all very kind of formalized and very media savvy. It's very personal, very deep, and he's got a very way of doing it. So I recommend listening to that podcast, A, because it's fun, but B, because it teaches you the art of deep and important conversations, which can also still be fun at the same time, I'd say.
Awesome. Well, that sounds like some great professional learning for me and what I do, so I'll make sure to give it a listen. Jonny Thomson, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Jason.
This podcast is recorded on the territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Buccheri. Until next time.